Hello everybody, welcome back to Inde-Car on the 10th of April. Now it's not often I do anything with the subject of economics in this show, but I wanted to deal a little bit today with what Scotland could potentially do with its own economy given half a chance and given independence, and we'll come back to that just shortly. Also in today's programme, it's been widely reported today that Scotland's train operating service has come forth in a survey of the most reliable services in the United Kingdom. Now, I've seen an awful lot of misleading comments by, I think you would classify them as non-independent supporters, who claim that Scotland is fourth in a field of five, which is absolute nonsense. There are far more train operators in the UK than just five. And we did come forth out of, I think it's something like a dozen or 15 train operating companies in the UK in terms of the efficiency of our trains. So, as I say, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the programme. What I wanted to deal with, first of all, is an issue of, I think, most importance to Scotland when it becomes independent, and that is how its economy is configured. Now, if you look at the Western capitalist model of business, it's based on, first of all, greed. It's based on making as much profit as possible, and it depends entirely on impoverishing the majority of people who buy whatever the goods and services are that you provide, to enrich a small number of people at the top of each corporation. Now that is the capitalist model. The idea is to make as much money as possible for the few people who've invested a lot of money or who are at the top of the tree in that particular organisation. And that business model has been considered for decades in the West as being the only one which really works in the global economy. But this has actually proved out to be not true. And the reason I say that is because the Chinese economy, contrary to what the West believes is the best capitalist model for business across the entire globe, the communist model of business is, well, not the communist, I was going to say the Chinese model of business is very different from our own. For one thing, the businesses and the banks in China are all, at some level, owned by the state. And so the state can decide what it pays its top executives, and it can put a cap or even reduce the salaries of those at the very top of its industries. And it does that. It has reduced the salaries of its top directors and the bosses of its banks and so on. And the Chinese economic model is very different from our own, despite the fact that they are competing in a global market. And they've been particularly successful, as we all know, in the electric vehicle market and in renewable energy applications generally, far, far more successful than the West has been. And that is why there are so many Chinese electric vehicles around, and why they're so far ahead of the West in terms of this technology. And it's not because they're making bigger profits. It's because they are not driven entirely by making profits. The Chinese model is based on not so much making as much profit as possible, but driving up productivity as far as possible. And that means making more of everything, more quickly and more efficiently. And they do that not by starving the workers, as we are led to believe, but just by simply paying them the going rate in that particular part of China. But not more than that, and they do not pay their executives vast sums, millions of pounds a year, to be at the head of these corporations. And because they basically are prioritising production, and research and development is driven as well by that production, the volumes they produce are what brings in the money. And so the Chinese economy has been enormously successful in accumulating Western foreign currency for the goods that it's been selling. Now, the reason I mention the differences between the Chinese sort of business model and the Western business model is the Western business model, by and large, has historically used its powers, if you like, not to make things better for its own people, which, as we've seen from the United Kingdom, the economy is definitely the case here. It's not making life better here, but it's largely based on war fighting. If you look at America, for example, particularly since 9/11, the American economy has been driven largely towards keeping as many of their military bases across the world, and that's 80, incidentally, big military operations of the United States across the globe in business. By comparison, China itself has only one military base, and it's in China. It's not anywhere else in the world. The Chinese do not use their economic power to dominate other places or to wage wars. They use their economic power to invest in other countries' infrastructure and to sell Chinese made technology to countries that are developing. Now, we in the West have been taught to see this as a threat to the Western hegemony when it comes to the economic model of the world. But the thing is that the current model that we operate is always doomed to collapse because it's part of its cycle. That's why we have booms and busts, because the cycle is driven by excessive profit taking to the point where eventually the market explodes and prices fall back dramatically and we have massive recessions. The Chinese model doesn't have any of that. There are no Chinese recessions because their model is based on the common good of the entire country and not on the good of the 1% at the top. Now, because I'm mentioning this because I think that a version of what the Chinese have been doing could work for independent Scotland. I'm not suggesting that we become a communist totalitarian state, incidentally, but what I am suggesting is that we have a look at why China has been so successful and perhaps employ some of the lessons learned from that here. Scotland is very good at manufacturing, it's very good at technology, but it is starved of funds as a part of the United Kingdom. However, if we are free to attract investment into our own businesses, and we adopted some of the elements of the Chinese model, for example, reducing the massive salaries that are paid to top executives in these businesses, and giving everybody a fair wage, good working conditions, regular holidays and other perks, and driving up both research and development and production, we could produce goods cheaper. Not just goods, but we could produce energy more cheaply as well than anybody else on the planet. And we would make our money as a nation through the volume of production that we achieve. In other words, we export so much of it that we don't need that massive profit margin to take money out of the global economy and impoverish the people who are actually buying the products and the services. So the Chinese model is based on volume and the Western model is based on profit. There is some middle ground here. There obviously needs to be some profit because you need to invest to expand your production. So the profit is there, but it's not excessive. I think, for example, if the Scottish Government, after independence, were to renationalise the energy industry, to fully nationalise public transport and run it properly, and perhaps to start things like electric vehicle design and production itself, but not to mention developing the new green energy grid far more rapidly and investing in it much more than it is at the moment, but doing so not for the profit of the firms that would be doing the work, but by investing in the public corporations which are doing the work. In other words, the way we used to have it when we had public utilities owned by the state, such as what used to be called the South of Scotland Electricity Board or the Hydro-Electric Board in the Highlands. These were both national monopolies. Power was produced by the state for the people at a very low cost, which was kept pretty much stable the whole time. Now, it wasn't subject to so-called market forces. And if you've been watching the energy market recently, you will realise that in Europe, people pay on average about £700 a year for their power bills. Whereas here in Scotland, inside the United Kingdom, our energy bills are well over £2,000 a year. Almost triple that of what European nations are currently spending on power individually as households. Now, why is that? Well, the Tories and the British politicians would have you believe that this is due to global inflation in the energy market. If that were the case, it would be affecting the European market as well. And Europeans would not be paying £700 a year, they'd be paying £2,500 or thereabouts, the same as us. So something is a lie here. And I think that something is that the profit being taken by the energy companies is being driven by capitalist greed, which is being enabled and encouraged by the Tory party, who are probably already in the pockets of these big corporations and are being encouraged and lobbied to give them as much profit as possible. That's why we suffer these huge cost increases. But if we control the means of production, which is basically the essential part of this, that wouldn't happen. And because Scotland is effectively a popular sovereignty country, the people here are sovereign. And you may have noticed I posted an audio blog by Professor Alf Baird earlier on this morning on my Facebook page. And Alf Baird was just outlining the fact that most people in Scotland don't realise they are sovereign. They don't realise what that means. And the story about their sovereignty is being suppressed, and probably not just by the United Kingdom's unionist parties and other actors. It may also be being suppressed by our traditional independence parties, who don't want you to know that it's not the politicians who hold the sovereignty at Holyrood, it's actually us. So because we have that popular sovereignty, after independence, we could direct our government to buy back all, or not even buy back, just take back control over all our natural resources and all our production of energy, specifically, to begin with, and other things as well. There are an awful lot of things which Scotland produces which are sold across the world highly successfully, but we don't see much return for it. But we could do if we changed the business model. And this is what I'm getting at today. The fact that the Chinese model has worked so well for the last 60 or 70 years for them, that their economy is in a much safer place than the West's, because the West is cruising for another collapse, because the banks have lent so much money to the capitalists that the repayments on these massive loans are almost now unsustainable. And national governments of the West owe so many trillions of dollars to these various banks that it's unlikely they're going to be able to borrow much more before there's another collapse and another economic crisis. However, the Chinese system doesn't actually have that, because it keeps everything stable. And that's what's missing from the global economy of the West: stability. Scotland could have that stability itself if it played the game but by its own rules. And this is what I've been saying, I think, for the last 25 years, that we need to play by different rules. You can compete in a world market against capitalism quite successfully, and the Chinese have proved that that can be done. The West has spent a long time in the media trying to rubbish the Chinese economy. They're claiming at the moment that Fitch, one of the banks, or one of the biggest sort of banking organisations which looks at how reliable a country is for repaying its debts, has claimed that China's rating has now gone negative. In other words, the West would now not lend to China. But then again, the Chinese are not trying to borrow anything from the West. This is just an attempt to make the Chinese economy look bad when it's actually much, much more stable than the one that we have. So I'm thinking, when we do become independent, that we need to formulate a new way of doing things. One which learns the lessons from the Chinese model and allows us to compete on what's left of the capitalist global market, which is going to be fractured, fragmented, with countries all over the world basically pulling up the drawbridges and entering into a major era of protectionism, where they stop globalised trade and they try to centralise all their production in their own countries and stop things being imported into their countries from other places. And that's always bad news for a global market. So this is where I'm at with my thinking at the moment, and I believe that Scottish politicians don't think this way, and there are very few economists in Scotland who seem capable of imagining a system like this. The other thing that we lack a lot of, and Alf Baird said this in his podcast, is that we lack any kind of constitutional legal experts in Scotland. There are very few constitutional lawyers in Scotland who understand that Scotland's population still holds its own sovereignty under the Claim of Right Act and under the previous declarations of the clergy in 1310 and the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320. All three of these documents guarantee that you, me and everyone else who lives in Scotland are actually more powerful than our own government. And we could actually, just simply by organising ourselves and having a mass vote on it, we could depose our own government and install one which actually was going to make the country independent. This is something which neither our own politicians want, because it basically threatens their positions and their jobs, And of course, it definitely is something that the United Kingdom doesn't want. Let's face it, why would they? They want to keep control of our resources when their own are dwindling. Anyway, to bring things back to the trains for a moment, it's worth remembering that the rail system in Scotland is only partially privatised. In other words, part of it is run by us, or part of it is owned by us, and that's the part that runs the trains, and that's the bit which has shown that it is the fourth best reliable train service in the United Kingdom, which is better than not being the fourth, but we could be the first. We could be the most reliable train service in the UK. But the tracks that these trains roll over in Scotland are not actually owned by or maintained by the Scottish rail system. They're not owned by Scotrail. They're actually owned by Railtrack, a British quango, I think you'd have to call it, a quasi-non-governmental organisation. That means a company which is directed by the British government to maintain the railway network at a fixed cost. And they do all the repairs and they track clearances and all the rest of it. But why is that the case in Scotland? Because if transport is not a reserved matter in Scotland, then why is the railway not owned by the Scottish Rail Company? It should be. It should be owned by you and I. It's our infrastructure. It's a bit like our rivers, our canals, our roads. These are all parts of our infrastructure which should be under the purview of our Scottish government. I wonder why they're not. Anyway, these are things I want you to think about when you're considering independence, and think about why it is that the Western capitalist system keeps collapsing. Why do we keep having these booms and busts? Why are so many people poor? And why is the number of poor people growing and the number of wealthy people not growing but gaining even more wealth? Something like about a fifth of the planet's wealth is owned by less than 1% of its population. There's something wrong with the system that impoverishes the massive majority of the population of an entire planet in favour of a teeny weeny tiny minority of incredibly greedy people who seem to hoover up all the rest of the cash. So I believe that a version of what the Chinese economic model is would work very well for a small country like Scotland. We could play the international global market game by a completely different set of rules, which would mean that our businesses, our corporations, our manufacturing base would rapidly expand. There would be full employment. Everybody would have a higher standard of living. The cost of living would be lower because production costs would be stable and lower, because we are not aiming to make maximal profits. We're aiming for maximal business success and maximal economic success for the entire population of the country. That's the way it should be in any country. The capitalist system, unfortunately, is always doomed to eat itself because it's just so greedy and avaricious. It adds to pollution, it destroys the planet, it uses up resources, it doesn't recycle things, it feeds on greed, it feeds on disadvantage and creating poverty and maintaining wars in order to keep itself in power in the global environment. That will eventually, I think, run out of steam because it's going to run out of money just because of the way it's actually working. So having a system like the Chinese one, or similar to it at least, would guarantee Scotland's stability for decades, for centuries to come. And that's why China's so successful, not because they make more profits than anyone else, they're not more greedy than anywhere else, they don't play the game better than capitalists in the West. They play by a completely different set of rules for different reasons, and their reasons are to do with the collective good of the entire country rather than the individual profits of individual people. Anyway, that's it from my my pulpit for today. I hope you enjoyed today's programme. A brief apology, by the way, because I know people have pulled me up recently for jumping on the bandwagon with Kate Forbes and worrying that the Scottish Government was making wood stoves illegal. Now, technically speaking, they are making wood stoves illegal, but only in new build properties which are being fitted with new modern low carbon or zero carbon heating systems. So people with wood stoves, don't panic. I'm sorry if I misled you yesterday. Like everybody else, I was fooled by a lot of misinformation going around, and I was surprised actually that even Kate Forbes didn't know what this new law regarding wood stoves was, and that's somebody who's a former minister in the SNP's government and who's an MSP who still didn't realise this until her own constituents started calling her worried that they were going to lose their wood stoves. Anyway, I apologise because I got caught out by the same misinformation, and that has been the characteristic of all of the pieces of legislation which have come into force this April, which were created by the Scottish and Greens government in Holyrood. So we've had the hate crimes bill, we've had obviously had the ferry scandal as well, but we've now had this new bill about wood stoves as well. And I'm sure there will be lots of others which are going to be conflated with misinformation being put about by people who hate the SNP or hate the Greens or just generally hate Scotland having anything different from England, or better than England in this case in some ways. But I think the problem here is communication. I've been a strong critic of the SNP for ages, that they don't communicate very well with the voters. They put out a press release saying there's a new law coming into effect, and that's it. They don't counter all the crap coming from the UK media, which deliberately misinterprets these new laws and stirs up hatred, stirs up panic, which of course it did with the wood stoves. So I apologise, I was a victim of that conflation, of that misinformation myself, and I shouldn't really have jumped the bandwagon like I did, but I was running out of time to source material for the show. That's my only excuse here. So anyway, I'll be a bit more careful in future about sourcing and making sure that any legislation that I talk about, I have actually found it first and read it through properly before I start pontificating in my usual fashion. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. I hope you've enjoyed the programme. Something to think about. But in the meantime, just remember the railways in Scotland are running pretty well. The ferries are all launched. And it looks to me as if Ferguson's will probably get the orders for the small ferries as well, because they do them so well. They've got a track record on that. And I don't think for a moment that the Scottish Government is going to not give these new smaller ferry orders to Ferguson's, because why would they? It'd be throwing people out of work. Alright, I'll see you soon. Remember to keep the faith, keep watching the programme, follow the donation links if you want to support the channel, and I will see you again shortly. Bye for now.